Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, Professor Karl Friston, I really appreciate you joining me today. It's an honor.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yes, you are I think you're the most cited neuroscientist in the world I've read. So that's quite a statement, and it's an honor to speak with you. And I think you're one of the most impactful neuroscientists in the world. So this really is an honor to sit across from you on the screen and get to chat with you and learn from you in real time and share your ideas with the world.
Yeah, in fact, I heard 2 days ago from research.com that I'm the second most cited neuroscientist in the world. I've been beaten by an American.
That's awesome. Well, I guess there's an ongoing race. You'll see how many more you guys can do throughout your lives. So I'd love to just ask you a couple questions to see, like, when did you become so fascinated with the nature of consciousness? At like what age, and how did that begin for you?
At quite an early age. I would say around the age of 15 to 16, when deciding what kind of exams to do and what kind of university course was the most likely to satisfy those interests. My usual response to that question is just to acknowledge the role of my parents. So my mother was a nurse who loved popular psychology. My father was a civil engineer, bridge engineer, who loved physics and geometry. So together, I thought the best thing to do would be to do the geometry of psychology and sentience, and then spend the rest of my life trying to position myself in order to explore those avenues in science and in academia.
That's amazing. And now in your current field, it seems like you're working a lot with AI as well, right? You have a company you're working very closely with?
Yes, I'm chief scientist at Verses, which is a cognitive computing company. And certainly that direction of travel, I think, is a natural expression of the agenda to understand natural intelligence. So I'm going to play the Feynman card here. That which I cannot create, I do not understand. So clearly, if I, as a neuroscientist and particularly as a psychiatrist, want to understand how I work and how my patients work, although I don't see patients anymore, then the obvious route forward is to try and build one and thoroughly understand the mechanics of sense making and decision making. And of course, industry and artificial intelligence research offers the perfect opportunity, the perfect sort of sandbox in which to try and create at least a minimal kind of intelligence predicated on the principles of natural intelligence.
Are there major concerns that you've become aware of as you start to delve into this field and you start to hear where AI is going, or is it mostly optimistic, or where are you standing with that so far?
I'm very sanguine, so I'm on the optimistic side. I look at this as an adventure for all of us, and particularly those people at the forefront of machine learning and artificial intelligence research. I am clearly exposed to a lot of anxieties, understandable anxieties about the impact of AI at a societal level and also at a personal level. But for me, this is just a natural expression of us as quintessentially curious species wanting to understand more about ourselves and the artifacts which we create.
Yes. It always seems like we're afraid of the unknown, the uncertainty as a species too. And I've, in my life, become a lot more, I guess, comfortable with uncertainty and just the fact that we really don't know, where we came from and where we're going. But I think that is the beauty of life and of science, to just keep exploring and expanding our awareness. And I've heard people ask you before through different conversations about how do you deal with the existential crisis once you start to to unfold the nature of what you've discovered, once you think that you're not really this free agent that you think you are, and your ego's been somewhat minimized. But I just seem to think it just makes it more interesting and more fun and exciting.
Yeah,
So
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, you can't be curious if you're not uncertain. The whole point of epistemic behaviors, the whole point of certainly my life, and I would imagine your life, in virtue of the fact you're sitting here now asking questions to resolve your uncertainty, the resolution of uncertainty pre-requires you to be uncertain. And there's a certain sort of epistemic allure, I think, to that kind of uncertainty, that there is the opportunity to understand, to resolve that uncertainty by actively engaging, querying the world, either as a scientist or as a podcast person, in exactly the way that's been exemplified in this exchange.
yeah, I agree. I just now in real time was thinking this, I'm thinking about ideology and how, from what I've gathered, it just seems to be like the biggest block that human beings have as far as progress goes, and the ability to just relate to one another. And if you wanted to get rid of war and all the issues that we have, it seems to be based on belief systems and ideological factors. Is that something that you've come to as well?
Yeah, I think that's an astute point. In fact, a friend of mine, Hector, has just written and possibly pre-printed a paper expounding exactly that point. So from the point of view, technically, one way of looking at that is that, in the resolution of uncertainty, in the search to optimize and maximize the evidence of our world models or generative models of the lived world, we are going to form more and more precise beliefs about the way that the world works. And if they get overly precise, then I think you could start to label that as an ideological commitment that precludes any further explanation. And I think that story has a lot of traction when you start to apply this kind of Bayesian mechanics or active inference to psychopathology. In psychiatry, for example, you see exactly the same sort of pathologies and problems when people become overly committed to a particular belief about their engagement with the world or other people. And particularly pernicious are those beliefs that preclude you from going out there and getting more evidence to actually get out of that sort of belief rut, that what some people describe in terms of having overly precise priors that sort of carve a canal, or very much in the same way that a river carves its own riverbed. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And of course, the deeper you get, the less easy it is just to explore and jump out and take other perspectives, and relax those prior precisions. And there's lots of very compelling stories, both in the psychiatric domain, but also the neurological domain in terms of movement disorders, where at a subpersonal level, exactly this pathology provides quite a compelling explanation for people who literally get stuck in a rut. And I think you're applying the same mechanics to the way that we exchange with people at a social or geopolitical level. Is, to my mind, a fruitful way of understanding the messes that we can get ourselves into, and potentially the interventions that might relieve that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had Michael Levin on a while back, and I know you guys are very familiar with each other's work and have talked. I love listening to you guys go back and forth. And that's one of the things I appreciate now about the fields of science, is that they're all talking to each other. And it really makes it fun for you to be speaking to a developmental biologist and then giving your perspectives and taking his on. He actually gave me 2 questions to ask you today, which we'll get to at some point. But I just love the way he thinks. And I also love how you can take from what he thinks and add it to your field. Whereas I feel like before there was so much isolation and not enough cross-pollination, I guess you could say, because the internet and because of all these subgroups and categories, so much faster to transfer information.
No, absolutely. I mean, he is. I think he is one of the prime examples of a scientist who really is trying to encompass and be inclusive. One of his missions is this notion of sort of basal cognition, that everything has this cognitive capacity, this sort of natural intelligence imbued in its very structure and form and its dynamics, which means that he can now start taking concepts, constructs from psychology and apply them to little worms, or indeed his little xenobots, little artificial creatures that he grows in the lab. And I think that's a glorious thing to do, to try and meet, the convergence of all these insights from different disciplines, mutually informing each other. But it does require somebody to come out of their silo and put their head above the parapet and say, well, look, there's another way of looking at this particular speciality that will, benefit enormously from another perspective. And then everybody knocks their corners off, and we do have these enjoyable conversations. So in fact, Mike and I, not only are we friends and correspondents, but we do actually collaborate at the moment with Nick Lane on the role of mitochondria in intracellular dynamics and how intelligent are these microscopic organizational principles.
That's so cool. Yeah, he's poetic, just like you. I love listening to you guys go back and forth. It's fun. It's like you can almost just lay down at night. I don't watch a lot of TV at all. It's mostly YouTube of people talking. But you two are very fun to listen to, going back and forth. It just blows your mind. And the Xenobots thing and what he's doing in the lab is just so fascinating. So what was I just going to ask you about mitochondria? I guess basically right now, mitochondria, there's a whole field just blowing up right in real time. And it seems like it's having such a fundamental impact on how we think about biology and even consciousness. What are you thinking right now about the nature of mitochondria and the impacts of light and water and magnetism and these things?
Yeah, you really need to speak to Nick Lane about this. So Mike and I will write 2 questions. You can ask Nick Lane, who's a third partner in this collaboration.
Perfect.
So, from my perspective, the intracellular dynamics that we're focusing on will conform to exactly the same principles of self-organization that you and I do. And that's important because that means you can now equip a description, you can describe intracellular dynamics and indeed intercellular communication using exactly the same physics and attendant rhetoric that you could apply to sort of social interactions or sense making at the level of human beings, for example. And the question now is, what are the processes that underlie that, and how far can you take that story? To what extent do mitochondria make inferences about their lived world, which is, of course, all living inside a particular cell? And to what extent now does that kind of sense-making and self-organization transcend scales as we get up to the scales, certainly of multicellular organization, which I know that Mike is particularly enthusiastic about in terms of understanding, in terms of cognitive processes and learning like and adaptive processes, right through to the brain as a collection of functionally specialized regions that comprise multicellular neuronal populations that themselves comprise ensembles of neurons that themselves comprise multiple intracellular organelles, including mitochondria. Mitochondria are particularly interesting because they are the powerhouse of what goes on. Certainly from Nick Lane's perspective, you could argue that this is the bedrock of some kind of minimal sentience, or I hesitate to say he would say consciousness, but I might hesitate to say that, which is I think a radical view, and a view that I imagine that Mike also subscribes to, that exactly the same principles are applied to every scale. So what we're talking about are sort of technically universal principles that are applicable in a scale-free fashion. One could argue with that. One could argue that you need to have at least a multicellular, or at least a scale of abstraction before you get interesting dynamics out. that would enable you now to draw a line between things that would you and I, or in the vernacular, one would regard as possessing sentience or consciousness, and those things that don't. And I know that Mike prefers this notion as a vague concept, a sort of philosophically vague concept, in the sense that how many grains of sand constitute a pile. There's no real sort of line you can draw. But there are counter-arguments to that, simply in virtue of the fact as things get bigger, the inside becomes more and more sequestered from the outside, and you might get more emergent, more complex kinds of what I would read as belief updating inherent in the dynamics of these systems, of the kind that would support consciousness in the sense of agency, for example, in the sense of self-awareness or qualitative experience. So, I would, I personally would subscribe to this sort of the consciousness can emerge, but it emerges under certain conditions, and those conditions would entail a certain degree of complexity and a certain depth to the structure of the dynamics of any system. And one can then argue whether you have that complexity and depth at the level of a single cell, or whether necessarily you have to actually get to the size of things like you and me, which are much bigger than, say, insects, which themselves are much bigger than viruses, which of themselves are much bigger than mitochondria.
Very fascinating. I'd love to hear you describe your theory, the free energy and the active inference principle, I guess you could call it. And just for average listeners, maybe some have never even been exposed to these ideas, but you're basically going down that avenue as we speak. And then I can ask you a couple questions that Michael had for you. And I'd love to get into emergence too, because you just hit on that a couple times. And I've heard so many people talk about emergence from different angles, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. Yes. I think that the notion of emergence is exactly what I was intimating when one moves up scales to bigger and bigger things. What kinds of dynamics emerge, and how can you describe those? But to come back to your original question, so when asked this, I always say, "Do you want the high road or the low road?" And I'll give you both very, very quickly. I'll try and do it very briefly because
Awesome.
I am not very good. When asked, can you briefly describe the free energy principle to people who have not come across it before? Strictly speaking, the answer is no. I am appallingly bad at describing this briefly, but I'll do my best. So you can take the low road, which basically would start with Plato and go through Kant and Helmholtz. Perhaps we should stop at Helmholtz in terms of his notion of unconscious inference, by which I mean that when we make sense of the world, or when anything self-organizes in exchange with its external milieu or its world, it can be read as effectively constructing explanations, predictions of what would be out there beyond, for you and me, say, a skull-bound brain, that is causing the sensory impressions. So emphasizing the distinction between the outside world, which we can never observe directly, and the sensory impressions and our sense organs, like our eyes and our skin and our ears, from which we have to make sense and infer what is actually causing that. Is there something out there? And if so, what is its intentions? What is its pose? What is its attributes? So this process of unconscious inference is, I think, places the free energy principle or active inference in the scope of theories that commit to the notion that brains particularly, and perhaps lots of other self-organizing systems, can be read as having a world or a generative model in their internal dynamics that can be understood as generating explanations, predictions of what would be seen on the basis of the evidence, and then the predictive coding version of this formulation would say that, well, if I have an explanation for what's going on in the outside world, I can predict what I would see if I was right. And then I can take my sensory impressions and subtract what I would see from those sensory impressions, and the result is a prediction error. And if I'm right, then the prediction error will be 0. So what I can now do is take the prediction error and use it to change my mind, literally by driving neural activity or any neuronal dynamics or any dynamics in order to minimize the prediction error. So I'm constantly trying to resolve prediction errors, and this makes the brain or casts the brain as a statistical engine, a prediction machine, a constructive organ, a statistical organ that's always trying to predict what's going on and then update its predictions on the basis of prediction errors or on the basis of sensory evidence that subtends those prediction errors. And you can now read that notion of a constructive brain engaging the sort of inside-out process of prediction in many ways, and many people have read it in a number of different ways in psychology through things like analysis by synthesis, notions of perceptions, hypothesis testing, right through to current formulations of the Helmholtz machine by people like Geoffrey Hinton and Peter Diane, and subsequent developments in artificial intelligence and machine learning, all committed to this notion that we embody generative models of our lived world, and that basically ties us to the world in the sense that we're always recapitulating, trying to predict on the inside what's going on the outside, and that leads to a sort of a generalized synchrony, mathematically a synchronization of chaos between the inside and the outside. So we are separate from the world. Technically, that separation is usually articulated in terms of something called a Markov blanket, an interface that both separates us from the world, but also intimately glues us to the world through this interface across which we can now exchange and synchronize and be in some kind of harmony with the world. The high road would be exactly the same story, but where you'd put physicists' labels on these quantities. So the prediction error would now become free energy, and you'd be talking about self-organization to some sustainable, technically a non-equilibrium steady state, in which you can read all the internal dynamics as minimizing free energy, minimizing prediction error. You can read free energy in a number of different ways. I'll just give you two just to bring this to closure. So the free energy is a statistical quantity that scores the prediction error or the surprise of some sensory input given a particular model of how that input was caused. And that surprise mathematically in information theory is known as self-information. And that's important because the average self-information in information theory is called entropy. So in minimizing surprise in the moment, that just basically describes me as minimizing the entropy of my sensory states and all the ensuing internal states or my internal dynamics, which means that I am going to try and resist the second law, or more simply, if I was a physiologist, I'm going to try and resist the dispersion of my states, and keep myself in some characteristic states. So it's just a statement of homeostasis of a particular and general sort that can be read in terms of minimizing self-information and thereby resisting the dissipative or the dispersive effects that would normally attend the physics of any self-organizing system. There's another really interesting interpretation, though, because that self-information, which is just the implausibility of some sense data given a model of those data, is also in statistics known as the evidence for the model, which means that in minimizing surprise in this continual fashion, I also look as if I'm trying to maximize the evidence for my world model or my generative model, which means that I can also be described, as philosophers would like to describe, particularly Jacob Howe, I can be described as self-evidencing. I will look as if I am gathering evidence for my model of the world, which brings us back to where we started, that I'm going to be an explorer. I am going to be quintessentially curious because I'm going to be sampling, querying the world in exactly in the best way that's going to provide the evidence for my model of the world. So I'm always going to be acting in a way to try and realize my predictions, yet at the same time resolve my uncertainty to improve my models. So what one has is a picture of any self-organizing system that can sustain itself for a non-trivial amount of time as acting in a way to minimize expected surprise, where you can read expected surprise in two complementary ways. The first one is expected surprise is again uncertainty or entropy, which means that I'm going to act to resolve uncertainty. So I'm going to be curious. So we're all little scientists in one sense, experimenting on the world, designing experiments, really simple experiments like I'm going to look over there as opposed to looking over there, because if I look over there, I'll get some visual data that will resolve my uncertainty about what I think is over there. That's a hypothesis that I can confirm. But if and only if I perform that visual palpation, that visual experiment in the moment, and we actually do this about 4 times per second. So that's the exploratory aspect, sometimes known as intrinsic motivation or responding to epistemic affordance. But the other way of avoiding surprise is not acting or acting in a way that precludes things that would be very surprising for me by being very cold or very poor or in some kind of pain. And that can be read as an extrinsic motivation, or the kind of motivation you'd find in reward learning or reinforcement learning. Basically, defining me in the sense that I am going to avoid states that would be surprising given the kind of thing I am. So you've got this lovely sort of dual aspect to minimizing expected free energy or expected surprise that has this sort of epistemic aspect and this instrumental aspect that speaks very closely to notions of reinforcement and value learning on the one hand, and optimal Bayesian design, and us exploring the world as opposed to exploiting from the point of view of this more extrinsic kind of surprise minimization.
Wow. You did a dang good job of summing that up, for how complex it is. But it brings me to wonder novelty and how much that plays a role in our, at least as humans, not other organisms, but just for us, it's like the monotony of life, especially now after in the West, we have this food, shelter, water thing met. We're finding experiences that give us novelty. And it seems to be one of the factors that keep us from suffering and minimizes suffering. I've always noticed that if you travel to a new country or you try a new sport or learn something new, it's one of the best features for minimizing suffering and keeping your mind healthy. So how does that play into this?
Well, I mean, I think novelty, I should have used the word novelty. So this epistemic aspect of minimizing expected surprise, namely minimizing uncertainty, manifests as acting in a way to resolve uncertainty in the moment, and that would be read by people in neuroscience as salience. We respond to salient cues. When it comes to the parameters and the connectivity that underwrite our world models or generative models in our brain, what we're doing is installing contingencies, laws, associations, and the epistemic motivation, the expected information gain, in my world, is called novelty. So novelty is absolutely key. So this, we can, there are many ways you can describe this dual aspect minimization of expected free energy. One way would be explore versus exploit. So one of the prime motivations for exploration is novelty seeking. It's one of the key components of information seeking that makes us all little scientists. So if by being healthy you mean just acting in the way that things like us act, then that will necessarily entail novelty seeking. And we see that at many different levels, whether we're exploring listening to new kinds of music, or listening to see how a particular riff resolves in jazz music, through to going mountain climbing in Nepal. These are all characteristics of things that will the characteristic of things that self-organize in a way to minimize their uncertainty and synchronize and adapt to their particular lived world. But I want to qualify that, because that may speak to something we were talking about before, about the vagueness of consciousness and versus there being a bright line between things that I would call conscious as opposed to not conscious. Notice that if I want to be information seeking, and this is the active part of active inference, I have to have a generative model of the consequences of my action. Because if I don't have that, then I can't evaluate how much information I will gain. I can't evaluate the novelty as it pertains to me. So novelty is very private to me, because some things can be very familiar and some things can be very, very novel. And only I know that, because that depends upon what I know. But I have to be able to evaluate the novelty of doing this as opposed to doing that. In evaluating it, I have to know the kinds of things I would see if I did this and did that. So this is really interesting, because that basically means that your world model, your model inside your head, has to entertain the future, because you haven't actually yet seen the novel stuff by definition. So you have to have a future pointing aspect to your generative model that's conditioned upon your actions, that's private to you. And I think that's a special kind of generative model. You could easily summarize this just in terms of the ability to plan. So planning, I think, does draw a bright line between certain kinds of self-organization, which I think it would be difficult to argue have the kind of consciousness that is associated with agents, and other things that have authentic agency in the sense that they can now select to do this or that because they have a model, a generative model of the consequences of doing this or that. And that basically means that you've got certain things that have the opportunity to select. And I think that notion of selection speaks to something you slipped in at the beginning of our conversation about free will and determinism. I personally think there are certain things, self-organizing systems like you and me, that are in a position to select our own futures, to author our own paths through the future, which are, again, private to me. And I think these kinds of things could be called agents. And I would guess that most people would see that kind of agency as a necessary characteristic of things that would be equipped with consciousness. Not sufficient, but certainly necessary.
Yeah. With free will, do you think it's something a little more specific to human because of language and things like this when it becomes to predictive models? Like, we are so much different than other species, so our free will is being influenced by a lot of our ideas and our cultural programming and our narratives and then our belief systems and all this. So how does that play into the free will of the human condition?
Well, I think it plays in a very important way. One, we can talk about it, and we can. We even have professional talkers like philosophers. So in the absence of language, there wouldn't be any philosophers who could talk about it. And I don't mean that in a trivial way, because if we can share things, then part of this information seeking imperative, this intrinsic motivation, this responding to these epistemic affordances, obliges us to predict others. So part of the world now that I'm trying to infer, in fact, you could argue the vast majority of the world that I live in and I'm trying to predict, is constituted by other things like me. And that minimizing that expected surprise, minimizing is equivalent to maximizing the predictability of you and inferring your intentions and your what you believe. So that means that most of our intrinsically motivated exploratory behavior is actually going to be mediated by conversation. And what's going to happen is that ideally we will come to share common ground, and there will be sort of an overlap, a synchronization of our generative models, and then we can share our beliefs about those generative models, making ourselves mutually predictable, thereby minimizing the joint free energy of our dyadic interactions. How does that play into scaffolding or shaping the notion of free will? Well, by now sharing our generative models, they're going to become increasingly refined, but also towards the opportunity for learning the right kind of generative model that one would need to live in a community, in a society, as a member of a particular species, to live with my conspecifics, means that I can not only learn from other people, but I can learn from my ancestors. Because now, through evolution, we can now pass not just the epigenetic specification of our generative models, but also through cultural niche construction, we can now pass the language that scaffolds and shapes those generative models. I mean, just think about it. Both you and I would spend the first 10 years of our life just learning from teachers and parents and others in whom we invested epistemic trust. So I think that's a beautiful example of how language shapes the very structure of our generative models, and in so doing affords what we used to be called scripts, that would be the sort of policies I was talking about in terms of choosing the policy, choosing the path into the future that minimizes expected free energy. I have to actually have a repertoire of ways forward into the paths into the future. These scripts or narratives are things that I inherit from conversations with you, and also decades of exposure to my parents and my teachers in that particular culture. So I think the narratives from which we select that underwrite this notion of free will. I'm willfully selecting this narrative as opposed to that narrative. The narratives in and of themselves are deeply shaped and sculpted by language and communication and by others, both within our social interactions, but also, I would argue, transgenerationally through cultural niche construction and evolutionary psychology-like arguments.
Yeah, beautiful. It seems that brings up the point of how important it is to constantly be trying to unprogram and unlearn, because of that first indoctrination, if you will, or the first years of our life, and throughout our life, the first 20 years even, you're just being downloaded with all of this stuff. And then it takes a little time and reflection, and there's different methods and tools to be able to see your narratives and your programming as a human to then be able to choose. But if you don't give yourself the space and the time, it's almost impossible, because you become identified with it. And that's the whole mindfulness stuff. Without getting too woo-woo, it's more of just observing your thoughts and then being able to see that you're not your thoughts, and then picking and choosing which ones you agree with, subscribe to, and which ones you want to let go of. And that seems to be more important than it is to always be taking in new information at some point.
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
going to for AI too, I was wondering what you think of for AI with the same conversation. When you guys are developing AI or many AIs, how do you sort of implant this way of the AI to develop its own free will, but not to go too far off the rails, and to keep it within a certain moral structure?
Well, that's a brilliant question, which is practically very relevant to current developments in industry, and in particular versus at the moment. So you have to, in developing or creating artifacts that are biomimetic in the spirit that we've been talking about as being curious machines, you have to install those prior structures. So recently they've been called core priors, and you could equate this with the epigenetic specification of the kinds of things I expect to encounter. but also you have to install the fundaments of active inference, which is exactly going out there and exposing yourself to the right kinds of experiences that would enable you to learn your world as efficiently as possible. So this means there's a slight departure from conventional, say, for example, large language models, which take the opposite approach, in the sense that if you want to mimic or create biomimetic artifacts that do the kind of thing that you and I did when we were in our teens and in our 20s, you have to equip them with the ability to know what is epistemically important, and it's technically not difficult to do. You just have to have a generative model, the consequences of the action of the machine or the artifact, and then enable it to score the expected information gain under that generative model if it did this or that, and then just pick those things that maximize the information gain, that induce the kind of novelty seeking that we're talking about before, keeping your options open, which a point you made, I think is absolutely foundational. And I can't resist, because that's exactly what Mike is doing, is keeping his options open, broadening the foundations of his scientific thesis. And so he doesn't get trapped in these ideological siloed perspective, close brackets. So that speaks to a very different kind of artificial intelligence that is much closer to natural intelligence and biomimetic, in the sense that you're sort of growing very, very small models that are self-growing and self-assembling, just seeking out those data, those experiences, that content that is going to maximally inform its generative model, and growing the generative model as in an experience-dependent way, much like you and I do when we're learning to ride a bike or just learning to walk. And that can create very, very efficient little artifacts, because in contrast to conventional machine learning, where you start off with an overly parameterized, very, very big, complex model and try and winnow down on what you actually need to train, say, your foundation model to fine-tune it to make it do what you want it to do. You're actually just equipping this model, or it is equipping itself, learning it in the right kind of way to grow to a minimal kind of efficiency of the kind that our brains enjoy. So we run on 20 watts, whereas you need a power station to power most the training of most large language models, euphemistically speaking. These biomimetic, natural, and one could argue sort of human pointing principles really do get into the game in a really practical way when trying to create that which I cannot, which I would need to understand, which is basically how would a little artificial intelligence learn about its world? Well, it would have to be able to be indulging curiosity and novelty seeking, and that's exactly what people are currently focusing on.
And that's beautiful. And do you ever notice? I'm a rational optimist, as it seems you are, because we're here and we're building something that we don't truly understand, and it's far beyond our comprehension, because it's actually so many people working on so many things that we couldn't even really take in what's already been created. It's almost going to take an AI to help tell the story as we go. But do you see the problems with things like social media and centralized scientific models that are driven by incentives that capture certain directions of the way science is going just for their own profit or reason, whether it be a defense or an intelligence from another country that they're trying to use for military purpose? There's just so many ways that people try to build, say, attention economies to just maximize attention, and it doesn't always work out too good. But with AI, I could see it being driven by so many people for so many incentives that it could probably become pretty nefarious too.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really profound point, and speaks exactly to the other aspect of your question, which I didn't address, which is the federation of all these little artifacts. I was just talking about the minimal requirements to actually have some semblance of natural intelligence in an artificial agent or artifact. The next question is, what happens when you put lots of them together? And furthermore, what happens when you put yourself, the user, into this ecosystem of natural and artificial intelligences? So we then come back to the principles we were talking about before, which are the principles of belief sharing and mutual predictability, generalized synchronization or synchronization of chaos amongst all of these. So exactly the same free energy minimizing principles apply in the context of federated or an ecosystem of intelligent agents. If we now treat everything as an agent, whether it's your Siri or whether it's a traffic light, a smart traffic light, or whether it's actually you, we are all agents with greater or lesser expressive generative models, depending upon the kind of world that we live and try to predict. So if you commit to this physics of self-organization that is just a description of things that self-organize in a sustainable way, then what you will get out of this exchange is effectively federated or collective and sustainable interactions that will have all these good qualities in the sense that they will be sating curiosity and novelty seeking. They will show in principle an empathy, because the whole point about communicating to make ourselves mutually predictable is that our generative models will converge, and therefore I can infer immediately your intentional stance, because I can judge by your behavior my intentions that would reproduce or explain your behavior, and therefore I can read your mind effectively without actually getting inside your mind. So this is exactly the kind of dynamic that ultimately one would hope would emerge from application of these first principle accounts of self-organization of this natural sort, of this surprise free energy minimizing sort. If you deviate in any way from that, you will deviate from sustainability. So I think your argument is quite powerful. You just highlighted a couple of examples of deviating from the right objective function, which is this surprise and or model evidence. And if we just move back technically to the notion that the model evidence can be decomposed into this information-seeking exploratory part and this sort of more exploitative constraint part. If you overemphasize one of the instrumental parts, say, I just want to maximize attention, or I want to maximize return on investment, or I want, if you just go for one monolithic, monothematic aspect, then you are naturally suppressing the epistemic part, the expected information gain. So no longer are your artifacts have any interest or curiosity in what you want, or being like you, or emulating you, or trying to infer you. There will be absolutely no opportunity for empathy. All I'm going to do, all my artifact is going to do, is trying to maximize ROI or maximize attention. That's not sustainable. It's mathematically provable, not sustainable. So all of these I do think represent serious dangers. But in virtue of the fact that we are a sustainable species, that is a natural way of things. People will realize, and they just won't want to buy these things, and there will be regulations, and there will be an antithesis to the algorithm that just wants to grab attention. And we've seen that already. We're seeing, at a societal level, there's acknowledgement that kind of purely value driven, where the person designing the artifact is actually prescribing the value as opposed to letting the agent itself prescribe its own value in the right kind of way that we've been talking about, is just not going to work. It's not sustainable.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to imagine, since we have been dealing with so much censorship on the internet, which to me is like a stunting of the capacity for information to flow freely. And there's so much of it now for different reasons, whether it be certain research is allowed to be heard and certain doctors or scientists are repressed. When you're developing something like this super intelligent AI system, and then we're also at the same time creating this computer brain interface stuff, the Neuralink and many others, which is almost where we're at with the screen time now, with everybody staring at screens with blue light and they're just being hit with ideas. but only the ideas that certain people want to be shared. My biggest concern would be mind control and social engineering. And we've seen how that's unfolded in the last 50, 60 years, and it's gotten progressively more intelligent, more sophisticated. And so it's more and more likely that you can take people's consciousness and direct it wherever you want it, which changes the behavior of society. Where do you see this computer interface and AI combination tech going? And how do you see mitigating the censorship and the ability for people to have free will or free thought?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I I personally see it going from a sort of quite straightforward perspective on self-organization. I personally think that there will be a um, a contrition, an attenuation of global collectivity. I certainly appreciate that having the opportunity to have access to bilateral and multilateral perspectives and sources of information is absolutely essential in terms of avoiding engineered or bad actors manipulating and controlling your social or political world model, the kind of actor that I am in a political, or what defines me. I appreciate that's an important aspect, but the danger of being overly exposed to all sorts of information is that you are putting an enormous pressure on this ability to freely select what you want to attend to, or what you want to sample, or the kind of thing that you want to question. So we come exactly back to this intrinsically motivated behavior, which is choosing to act in a particular way that's going to maximize your information gain. And if you offer too many opportunities, it makes it extremely difficult to select the right ones. And I have to just bring you back to something you observed about yourself, which I found very interesting. You don't watch television, you listen to podcasts. So I thought it was a beautiful example of epistemic foraging that's motivated exactly by you knowing what is going to resolve your uncertainty and delight you in terms of exploring the right kind of way, seeking the right kind of novelty. Imagine you didn't have that opportunity and that you were forced to watch television all the time. It would be extremely difficult then to assign the right kind of epistemic trust, or to select the right policies in terms of what to attend to or to assimilate in an informed way. That kind of pathology, I think, could also be articulated in terms of we are built, and indeed we are defined by the sparsity of the way that we engage with the world. So, one simple example is that we use our eyes very, very efficiently simply because we can only see a very, very small portion of the visual field. So we have to really concentrate and evaluate carefully where to look next to actually knit together and accumulate on the inside a percept to construct the scene perceptually that best explains these sparsely sampled observations. If I was exposed to the entire visual scene at once, it would be overwhelming. And I say that simply because this would be one way of describing severe autism. If you can't attend away and ignore the right stuff that needs ignoring, that's not informative, and you're constantly obliged to assimilate everything, whether it's relevant to you or whether it's going to improve or inform your model of the world, you will be rendered autistic, or a low functioning, severely autistic. So what would that look like at a societal level? It basically means we have a generation of informationally autistic people. What will that do? Well, because you can't now build what some people refer to as centrally coherent world models or generative models, because you're not able to pick out the right kind of right kind of information. You have a very coarse-grained representation of your world, and that it can be, if you like, read as polarization. Of many, many different sorts. So it could be, it could manifest as a kind of alexithymia, as my friend Ryan Smith would say, where, my self models, the hypothesis I bring to the table to explain my state of mind at the moment, particularly say in an emotional context, is just good and bad. I have no finesse, and perhaps I don't even have, even that bipartition. I can't differentiate between feeling slightly anxious and feeling sad or feeling embarrassed. I'm just good or bad. Or it could be I'm for Trump or Biden, or I'm for Brexit or not, or I'm for my populist, right-wing leaning politician, or my more liberal left-leaning politician. And interestingly, that kind of sort of coarse graining and lack of finesse and complexity and nuance that inherits from not being able to ignore all the sources of information available to you, not being able to select the right ones because you don't know how to, because you haven't built a sophisticated world model yet. The only stable solution to that is where you're always classifying things in terms, or committing 50-50 to that. So that would, when you actually sort of simulate this kind of belief sharing and belief updating, the only stable solutions are that where half the population believes one thing and the other half of the population believes another. And I'm just amazed every time you hear about these knife edge elections that just polarize people. It's always 50-50, for the past, for as long as I can remember, since watching the news in our modern times, you see this. It's 52% for this and 48% for that. It's always on a knife edge. That's the only way it can be. Once you get this degradation and coarse graining of the way that we represent ourselves, we lose that finesse, we lose that nuance that we would have had we just been talking to people in our village, or even within our family.
Yeah, it's more important now than ever, too, to unplug from these devices and these screens if you want to maximize your ability to have attention. And it seems like the attention economy is being driven by the algorithms and the engineers that want to divide, and polarize. So it's really a manufactured system by somewhat capitalizing on people's primal components of their brains and their physiology and getting them emotionally jumping onto the right or the left and putting people in these ideological camps. So it just seems like it's happening more now than ever, and it would be more important now than ever to spend more time in nature and slow down, unplug, and actually see what it is that you actually are, and have a little bit more self-awareness. But it's hard in this culture. The younger generation is becoming more and more low resolution, and their attention is being stripped faster and faster. And it seems like they don't even have the ability to read history or take account for what already has happened to get us to where we are. They're just being swept into an algorithm. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that, but that I think that was beautifully put. And what came to mind was what you've just described as exactly the pathology of addiction. So when you look at the sort of attention mechanisms in the brain, they are mediated by exactly the same nerve or neuronal chemicals, neurotransmitters, that are targeted by drugs of addiction. So what is a remedy? Well, the remedy for this is going to be exactly the kind of detox that you articulated in terms of making your own space. You mentioned mindfulness and meditation. I think these are beautiful examples of reclaiming control over the deployment of your own attention, just focusing on something you're choosing, whether it's your breathing or your internal machinations, just becoming skillful at attending as opposed to just looking at what is given to you with no triaging and no active selection of what you actually are imbibing.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like the book Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, which talked about soma, as the thing that would take people's life force energy, which is their attention. And now we have this low grade, screen time addiction, which is being engineered for the attention economy, is the soma of our time. And so are vape pens and TikTok and all this stuff. But it seems to be happening where people are happy to give their time and attention and their life to something that feels just good enough to numb the pain of the existential truth that we're all going to die, or maybe that you don't really have a purpose or meaning in this life. So I feel like people need to just pull out of it a little bit, and that mindfulness practice could be helpful. But you've studied schizophrenia and spent some time working with that. Can you describe a little bit about what you know about schizophrenia and what the modern research has shown to treat people with schizophrenia and things like that?
Yes, many of the theoretical ideas we've been talking about were motivated by schizophrenia research. So I was in the early part of my life, I did physics and psychology at university, then became a medic and then a psychiatrist. In brief, I think schizophrenia yields to an explanation very much along the lines that we were just discussing in relation to autism as a parody of what may be happening to people who are overexposed to social media and other sort of newsworthy channels. What I normally start off by saying is that if psychology is just, or if cognition of the kind that we've been talking about is a process of inference, inferring something, finding the best guess or best explanation that makes the most sense of the evidence available to me, then a pathology, a psychopathology of that kind of inference can be read as false inference. And that basically means that there are two ways in which you can falsely infer. And if you talk to a statistician, these are known as type 1 and type 2 errors. Put simply, it means that you can infer something is there when it is not, and that would be something like an hallucination or a delusion, or you can infer something is not there when it is. And this actually covers a whole spectrum of dissociative orders, used to be called hysterical disorders, neglect syndromes, and possibly some neurological syndromes. So I think the perspective brought to the table by this sort of active inference interpretation of free energy minimization is particularly useful in understanding things like schizophrenia, because now you're asking, what would cause, how could I understand my inferences that something is there when it is not? And the current explanations rest very much upon these attentional mechanisms that we're talking about. So in the brain, the way that we implement attention is not by pushing a button or selecting this channel or that social media, but there is an equivalent selection process, which a psychologist would understand as attentional selection. Physiologically, it involves boosting the excitability or the gain or the sensitivity of certain neuronal or nerve cell populations that are broadcasting the prediction errors that we were talking about before that now change my mind. Now, that means that you could easily understand the kind of false inference you see in schizophrenia in terms of delusions and hallucinations if it is a response to a failure to actually do this attentional selection through enabling the excitability of certain neural populations via exactly the same neurotransmitters that we were talking about that underwrite, say, addiction. And that leads to a picture of a brain of somebody that has schizophrenia that can be described in terms of pernicious kind of disconnection, that you have a pathology in which it's very difficult to coordinate or switch on and off various connections. And if you start off very much like the picture of autism that we talked about before, where you can't actually switch off anything, you can't attenuate any attention or any source of information, then one natural response to that, one compensatory response, is to increase the precision or the excitability of your deeper parts of your generative model that are further away from the sensorium or the sensory interface with the world, and effectively disconnect. And that's when you get the opportunity for hallucinations and delusions. So in summary, in my world, the best model of schizophrenia would be one in which there is this failure to select the right internal communication channels that underwrite the proper kind of sense making, that particularly implicate attentional mechanisms and their associated neurotransmitter systems. And we know that's a plausible picture simply because of the beliefs that are reported by people who have schizophrenia, but also the response of that false inference to certain drugs that act exactly on the neurotransmitter systems that are in charge of modulating the connectivity or the excitability of particular populations of neurons in the brain.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Have you heard any of the studies done on ketogenic diets and schizophrenia and seeing how the microbiome is tied to some of these issues?
I haven't. My apologies. I have friends who are desperately interested in that. Professor Ed Bullmore being one of them, and I think Mark Rakel, who was one of the good and great of brain imaging, has focused on that. No, my apologies. I haven't. I am aware of sort of all the neuropharmacology, but I'm less fluent and less of a scholar when it comes to this sort of more embodied context. What I will say, though, is that there is a full acknowledgement that the extended, the embodied brain also conforms to these principles, including things like the immune system. And that there's a kind of self-organization and dialogue, which is exactly the same as this sort of mutual sense-making that we've been talking about before, between the brain and the immune system and the endocrine system. And that if there's pathology in one, then it's likely then to be pathology in another, with a circular causality. So that lends an interesting interpretation of immunological responses that could also make false inferences, that could be both cause and consequence of neuronal or brain-like sense-making and belief updating. So I have colleagues who are sort of very committed to this sort of broader perspective that brings in the mesenteric nervous system in the gut, the immune system, the metabolic, and endocrine system, neuroendocrinology, in quite a formal way. And one sort of compelling example of that is it's very, very difficult to differentiate between somebody who comes into accident and emergency to the emergency clinic in a hospital in an acute florid psychotic state. And you now find it very difficult to say, have they got an acute psychosis, or do they have an encephalitis? It's almost impossible to actually differentiate between the two. And the encephalitis, of course, is just like possibly an autoimmune or possibly infection initiated immune response. So the body, the gut, and the immune system and our physiology are all intimately tied to failures of this kind of self-organization that manifests in terms of reporting our symptoms through the brain, but actually its causes could be I repeat, much more inclusive and embodied.
And I've heard there's an increase in schizophrenic breaks now because of the increase in psychedelics being more normalized in the last, I guess 30 years, but really increasing in the last 15 years, plus the ramping up of cannabis where they're making such strong THC products. And so you're getting a higher number of people that are actually falling into a schizophrenic state that maybe would have never otherwise had those situations.
Absolutely. When I talk to my erstwhile colleagues, who continued in psychiatry, that's exactly what they say. In the old days, you would expect to see a 21-year-old come in who was, previously very high functioning, possibly even a university student who was going slightly off and, having shown these prodromal symptoms of schizophrenia. Now that never happens. They all present age 15 or 16 having taken some drugs. It's completely changed. And it's interesting to note that the psychedelics, and particularly the 5-HT2A agonists, the serotonergic, things like psilocybin and the like, they act exactly on the receptors, on the neurotransmitter systems that I was talking about before, that set the excitability, technically, mathematically, it's called the precision of the cells that are reporting the predictions and the prediction errors in this predictive coding formulation. And that's a very active field of research. And people are now using these psychedelics to get a much better handle on this coordination and routing, if you like, of the message passing inside the brain that implements this attentional selection and this epistemic foraging. But I have to say, just to sort of counterbalance the worries about drug taking and its potential to initiate a psychotic episode, there's also enormous potential in exploring psychedelics and related drugs from a therapeutic perspective. Because they are so potent, it means that they potentially have great potential for managing, probably with assisted, as an assistance to sort of cognitive or talking or psychotherapy, to manage some of the more florid symptoms, or indeed of psychosis, and indeed just normal grief reactions or end of life risk, in end of life care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've even seen the results of traumatic brain injuries being benefited so much by the use of psychedelics in the proper setting. And there's so much good coming from it, and so much, not overhype, but there's a lot of hype around it. And I've been to a lot of the conferences over the years and been fascinated by this subject. And it led me down, because I used to be so, let's give them to bring them on. These are great because they're helping everyone, and they actually benefited me as a first responder. And I've seen a lot of people that were veterans and first responders really benefiting from them, and still do. But it led you down the avenue of seeing the darker history of these things and how they've been used for terrible reasons, for manipulation, persuasion, suggestibility. And now with the hype of them and the somewhat deployment of the narrative as medicine and tools for healing, there's a lot of big investors in the pharmaceutical industry. And I have seen their track record with the Oxycontin and things like that, where it just hasn't always gone too well, where they capture it, they promote it in one certain way, and then the public trusts authority. That's just the nature of the beast, is that we're so suggestible and we trust authority. So when you start to push psychedelics in a certain context, I could see it being bad too. As much as there's good, I can also see it being over pushed in a certain way, especially an authoritative model. But, it's just part of the balancing of the conversation as well.
Right. Yes. I didn't know that. Interested in terms of pharma, and you should get, perhaps you have already, get Robin Carhart Harris on this podcast. So he's a long-term colleague of mine who used to be at Imperial College and is currently now professor of psychedelics, effectively, at University of San Francisco, I believe. But he has will have a very balanced and broad perspective on this, and will be acutely aware of the therapeutic benefits, but also the dangers of uncontrolled prescription or abuse of these kinds of drugs. So, one aspect of that was implicit in my use of assisted psychotherapy, where you've really got to contextualize the administration of these kinds of really powerful drugs very, very carefully, both in the administration not just at the point of administration and ingestion, but also for the months afterwards. So Robin's argument, which I think is a very plausible argument, which has actually been expounded in the peer-reviewed literature, is that these drugs not only have an immediate effect on your ability to attend at different levels of abstraction, of course, being psychedelics, you're normally dissembling that centrally coherent, deeply structured explanation for your visual world, and you're now obliged just to attend to the elemental, very much like it. I imagine it must be like to be severely autistic. Every element, every sort of elemental visual feature now you can't ignore, and you have to find explanations for it. This house is now a face, or this visual motion is now actually my hand flying off into the corner of a room. Those drugs, can potentially induce these psychedelic states, but they also may have something you mentioned, the capacity to affect something that you referred to earlier on, which is this plastic potential, and that may endure for weeks, if not months, which again could be very dangerous if you're doing the wrong things during this period of increased plastic potential, or it could be an immensely important window of opportunity for intervention and assisted, either psychotherapy or behavioral therapy during this time. And that ability of these drugs to render you more plastic and malleable in the way that you're updating your world models speaks very much to what we're talking about earlier in terms of being able to relax the precision or the depth or the degree of commitment to particular ideological or other ways of behaving. So again, speaking to the therapeutic potential, but also the potential dangers if it's not done in the right way. And Robin, along with about 10 plus other senior scientists in translational clinical neuroscience, now likens this to sort of affecting the way that we canalize our beliefs, the way that we imagine our belief structures and our commitments and our understanding of the world as moving around on some fitness landscape, which incidentally is a free energy landscape, and digging itself deeper and deeper canals in exactly the same way we were talking about. And then the psychedelics basically relaxing the depth of those canals, enabling you to explore, possibly for, I repeat, weeks and months afterwards, different ways of behaving, different ways of looking at yourself, and or changing or accommodating or adapting to a new situation. Say, for example, you've lost a loved one or you've had a traumatic experience. So you now need a different kind of world model that now can embrace and accommodate that particular change in your life and the implicit change in your world.
Yeah. Oh, I would love to talk to Robin for sure. I'm pretty familiar with the work, and it would be nice to have him on. So I'm curious if you'd be willing to talk about your own personal use with psychedelics and if they've been beneficial to you or how that's looked over your lifespan.
I only took psychedelics when I was a student, but it was an extremely beneficial experience just in terms of realizing how precious and delicate our connection with reality via the sensorium is. I had never realized previously how much my reality is constructed and what a gift that is. If you could dissolve it within minutes or hours neurochemically, I think that's an enlightening experience. So that was, I've never forgotten those experiences. I have to confess, I've never re-indulged because of because they were so profound. But I do remember valuing the experience for about a year afterwards, just sort of reconnecting with that sense that, I should really appreciate everything I take for granted in the way that I perceive the world. I can imagine if I had a traumatic experience that they would be a mechanism a particular tool to give me another perspective on things. But my life has thus far been sufficiently predictable that I can sort of use what I take for granted quite effectively and in an apt way.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. It's not always about going back to the wishing well, So sometimes a one and done is probably a good answer. I'd love to ask you those questions that Michael had for you so we don't forget, because I keep thinking about it in the back of my mind. He said, what are some of the areas, if any, that the free energy active inference formalism may not be ideal?
That's a cheeky question.
Yeah.
I have to say, if there was a domain or some explanandum that did not yield to the free energy principle, then one would have to seriously revisit the utility of the principle. So I have yet to see something that cannot be accommodated or explained by the free energy principle, with some suitable hard work and heavy lifting in terms of the kinds of generative models that are implied by a particular phenomena. So I am assuming that these things, domains of application, do not exist, because if they did exist, I'd have to abandon the free energy principle. That's a trite answer, but it's an answer which I feel after about 20 years, feel pretty confident. There is nothing that you cannot apply the free energy principle to, should you want to. I'm not saying that's a particularly powerful application. One could argue that you could understand everything under the auspices of evolution. And you could say that the theory of natural selection was a powerful theory, but it's not. It's a principle or a theory. There are no principles of natural selection that has great explanatory scope, but it doesn't do any heavy lifting for you. And I see the free energy principle very much in the same spirit. It just defines a calculus and set of methods that allow you to tackle this or that, depending upon what you want to understand, simulate, reproduce, or emulate. There was a second part to your question. I've forgotten. Could you reiterate
Yeah,
the question?
because he did put a hyphen at the end that says, "Do you think it's a grand unifying theory, or are there areas where you will need something else?" And that's what you were seeming to get at, which is more of an orientation towards how we think about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's the full question is, what are some areas, if any, that the free energy active inference formalism may not be ideal for? And then that's when he hyphened and said, do you think it's a grand unifying theory, or are there areas that will need something else?
Well, from the point of view of the physics, that's a really interesting question. So the way that I conceive of and the free energy principle is sold is that it is a complement to the rest of physics. So it's not unifying in that sense. It is not, if you like, a replacement for quantum mechanics or stochastic or statistical mechanics or classical mechanics, Newtonian mechanics. It is a Bayesian mechanics that actually shares the same commitments of all of these other things. So in a very simple-minded way, quantum mechanics is the best kind of mechanics to deal with very small things. When you're dealing with ensembles of very small things, then you would use stochastic or statistical mechanics. When you're dealing with very big things, massive bodies, astrology, it's not astrology, astrological scales, then you would use Newtonian or classical mechanics. So Bayesian mechanics sits in the middle there. Technically, when there is an admixture of both dissipative and non-dissipative dynamics, but it's not unifying in the sense it speaks to a particular scale, which brings us back to the size of things, which I was trying to emphasize before. You wouldn't need the free energy principle to describe the motion of heavenly bodies like the moon. You would use classical mechanics. You wouldn't need the free energy principle to describe quantum effects. You'd use quantum mechanics. But you couldn't use quantum mechanics or classical mechanics to describe you and me. That's when you would use Bayesian mechanics. So in that sense, it's not a unifying theory. On the other hand, well, you could argue that it's sort of pre-physics because you could actually write it down as information theory, but no, I won't. It's not unifying, but within the scale of its applications, the domain of its applications, it is certainly unifying in the sense that it brings together psychology, and this is a line from Chris Fields, that it brings together sort of the physics and the biology and the psychology, and one could argue the philosophy of things at the scale of things of you and I, of our lived world. So it is unifying in that sense, in the same spirit that Mike likes to talk about basal cognition, or cellular biology in terms of psychology. It's unifying in that sense.
Awesome. Yeah, I bet he'll appreciate that answer. He had one more, and it was, which of the major philosophical schools of thought about the mind-body relationship is his formalism most compatible with?
I can cheat and give you a very quick answer. The answer to that question is transcendental idealism.
Okay, can you go a little further?
Well, no, I can't, because I have no idea what that means. Seriously. So that comes from actually Maxwell Ramstead is the person who told me that I'm a transcendental idealist. So I've got lots of friends who do philosophy, people like Andy Clark and Jacob Howe and the like, and lots of younger friends who do it. But I myself have absolutely no idea. But the answer is a transcendental idealist.
I like that. Do you think there's always going to be a need for philosophy, especially as we go into the future with AI? Is that always a necessary field?
I guess so, yes. I mean, we're all natural philosophers, and I think philosophers, just coming back to one of your themes, this ability to stand back and make space and think, just get a better picture of yourself and situated in your world. I think philosophers do that. Their whole life is just about standing back and thinking about things and contextualizing things. So I can't see academia or natural philosophy without that kind of introspection and formalism. I'm not saying that I want to be a philosopher. I don't believe you can do science without mathematics, and I don't see very much maths in philosophy. But I do really value the narrative exchange with philosophers. That's certainly been formative in my journey.
Awesome. Yeah, I've always been curious about consciousness, mainly from the vantage point of like wanting to minimize suffering in my own life and in the lives of others if we can. And I like to think about, what are the best ways and what is the best discoveries that we've found that would minimize suffering. And I'm curious what you think, after all your years of studying consciousness, that are the root of suffering and maybe would even be the things that could be able to be used knowledge-wise to minimize suffering.
Yeah, well, I would just read suffering as basically unresolvable surprises. So you're just now looking at all the things that would preclude Bayes' optimal inference in the spirit of active inference. And I think we've actually covered a lot of the main culprits in our conversation, ranging from the neurochemical and possibly experience-dependent pathologies of neurotransmission and schizophrenia, right through to fake news and globalization of electronic communication and the algorithm. So all of these are speaking to a particular and pernicious kind of pathology that attends aberrant or suboptimal kind of belief updating at many, many different scales. And as soon as you have that, you have suffering. So if you just read suffering basically as perceiving myself to be in an uncharacteristic state, equipped also with a sort of an emotional self-modeling that, I have to say that the ability to say I am suffering is also actually a gift. It's just something which you won't you probably don't find in a virus. So it is a gift, but of course, if you can't resolve the state of mind that probably arises in virtue that it can be self-attenuating or self-vitiating, the state of mind that I am suffering, then you will have no explanation for all those surprise or suffering minimizing mechanisms that are described by active inference. And also, you could read suffering as the complement, the opposite of sustainability, in some sense. And if I persistently and perniciously deviate from the characteristic states that I believe I should occupy, then basically what I'm describing is a kind of life that is not sustainable, where sustainability just is occupying, from the perspective of a physicist, the states that characterize the kind of thing that I think I am. So, much of the application of the free energy principle and active inference, I repeat, it was motivated by computational psychiatry in order to understand suffering from the point of view of a psychiatrist. Much of the deployment of these ideas outside my particular sphere of expertise, but more in terms of sort of social inference and emotional inference and multi-agent exchanges and epistemic communities, which is actually the title of a paper by one group of colleagues, is addressing exactly the same kind of suffering, but at the level of collectives and ecosystems.
Beautiful. No, thanks for sharing that. I want to be respectful of your time, but I always like to ask all my guests, if this was the last thing you could say to the world, the last time you could speak, what would you want to share with the world?
I think keep your options open.
Simple and to the point. Keep your options open. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been an honor to speak with you. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you. It was a very enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.